Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us through just some examples of what companies, and this is what we've kind of seen for ourselves as part of our research process in analyzing these company disclosures to develop these 50 fact sheets. And these are examples of how companies are disclosing in a TCFD aligned way across the four themes or pillars of the TCFD framework. We're not necessarily saying that these are best practice, but these are practical examples that you may wish to revisit and to align with in terms of your own organization's disclosure against TCFD, or at least you can be familiar with the types of disclosures that your asset managers, when investing on your behalf, are actually reviewing. And I think after we have covered this section, there'll be an opportunity for a lunch break. We'll probably shorten it so that we can actually let you go a few hours earlier this afternoon. But this will be the last little bit of content before we move into a lunch break. So again, following the theme of the TCFD's four pillars and looking at governance and disclosure on, from a governance perspective, how TCFD and climate risk specifically is being addressed. This is from the Investec Group 2021 TCFD report. They have a standalone TCFD report. So this is obviously for Investec Group, and we know that 91 has been unbundled. And so I think this is for the blended group. But again, one gets to see there how the board is structured and how the board of Investec Group is having oversight of climate-related risks. So again, there's narrative, there's an infographic just demonstrating how Investec Group is governing climate risks, and this is in their TCFD report. Moving on, also from the TCFD report by Investec, they talk about the link between climate and executive remuneration and how their executive and management team are remunerated around not only financial performance, but also addressing climate risk and other non-financial aspects. I realize that the screen or the slide may be a bit small. So in terms of financial targets or indicators that are looked at, they look at return on risk-weighted assets, return on equity and cost-to-income ratio. And then under the non-financial indicators that they're looking at, culture, values, and cooperation-related measures. Then there's an indicator for ESG-related measures, and then there's also an indicator for prudential and risk management-related measures. So Investec already moving in the direction of incentivizing and remunerating the management team in terms of both financial and non-financial or more ESG-related performance. And that's also importantly in terms, this is an important development for us to really focus management's attention on addressing material risks, such as climate-related risks. So just reading that little paragraph there under executive remuneration, Investec says non-financial and ESG-related targets are included within executive remuneration with a total weighting of 20% of short-term incentives and 25% of long-term incentives, of which 5% relate to ESG-related matters. The following table indicates the weightings and threshold targets. So again, I think as investors and as stakeholders of financial services firms like an Investec or a 91, this is the type of disclosure that one expects to see more and more of in terms of governing and the management of ESG and non-financial matters by the executive management team, and how to incentivize and remunerate for that. One of the other disclosure pillars under governance by the TCFD framework is management's role in managing climate risk. And so again, looking at the TCFD report from Investec, there is a narrative explanation of how Investec goes about managing, from a management perspective, climate-related risks and opportunities. And you'll see in the quadrant there on the left-hand side, they talk about the chief executive's responsibility, a group ESG executive committee's responsibility, individual executive responsibilities, as well as a global head of sustainability and their responsibility as it relates to TCFD. They also look at climate risks and opportunities, both in terms of short-term, medium-term, and long-term. So a timeline of anything between less than a year to more than 40 years. And they also break that down into physical and transition risks, and also looking at the opportunities. So opportunities like resource efficiency, markets, products and services, and resilience. And again, what we're trying to say here is, Investec has obviously done a lot of work in preparing this report. They are demonstrating that they've applied the TCFD framework in their reporting and disclosures. And, it's a good example of a recently published report. And of course, one is likely to see similar types of reports coming out from some of the other entities, that may not be featuring in these examples, but we encourage you to keep your eyes out for other disclosures. Also from the Investec report, really unpacking materiality and looking at different risks and kind of trying to communicate that in a clear and easily understandable way, and communicating to their investors and stakeholders their approach to strategy as it relates to climate risk. So here they've got a risk lens looking at policy and legal risks, technology risks, market risks, reputational risks across different time categories, short-term, medium-term, and long-term, and of course, different actions that they'll be taking under each of those. Then also looking at specific physical risks, both from an acute and a chronic perspective, as well as, over different time frames, as well as potential liability or litigation risk. They also have reporting on climate-related opportunities, which they see, again, also over the short, medium, and long term, across the different categories of resource efficiency, energy source, products and services, markets, and resilience. So obviously a lot of work has gone into the preparation and development of a report of this nature. Then in terms of the next pillar that they report against, risk management, how they identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks, and some kind of information about their risk appetite and tolerance, and some of the mitigating actions that they're taking as part of their risk management process. Again, this section of the report goes into how they categorize risks as high risk, medium risk, or low risk, and aligning to the World Bank's International Finance Corporation guidelines in terms of high, medium, and low risks from an investment perspective. Here they report on their metrics and targets, and so they've got governance metrics, they've got strategy metrics, and they've got environmental metrics, and they give their targets and their target dates, and then importantly, they also give you an indication of whether or not they're on track to having achieved their target, whether it's a new target or where maybe they've missed their target and it needs to stay on the agenda for the next financial year. Also just other ways of displaying some of their achievements and focus areas using graphs and other useful performance data presentations, talking about their carbon footprint at group level and the kind of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, all examples of the types of metrics and disclosure data that increasingly investors and stakeholders are requiring entities like Investec to disclose on. This speaks specifically to their exposure to fossil fuel and how Investec as a banker or a lender is lending to fossil fuel entities or companies, and breaking that down by coal, oil and gas, natural gas and renewables. And of course, the emerging trend to move towards renewable energy, funding and lending as opposed to old generation coal-fired power generation projects. I'm not going to go into all the detail here. Here they talk about their ESG loan book, and looking at what they are funding in terms of high-risk industry from a transition risk perspective, and where their kind of exposure lies. So from an ESG industry portfolio where there's a high rating, they list transport, mining, construction, manufacturing, wholesale and retail, business, utilities and agriculture, and they break that up as Investec Limited and Investec PLC. And I think going forward, 91 will have their own kind of standalone TCFD report as well, which will focus more on the asset manager as opposed to the so I think there's just one example of one particular reporting organization, Investec Group Limited, giving us an indication of what is possible when you provide the right resourcing and strategy and incentives to really onboard the TCFD recommendations and how to go about disclosing them.